Hello, and welcome to the Town of Gilbert Landscape Workshop on Hummingbird and Butterfly Gardening in the Desert. On this presentation, we're going to talk about all the different things you want to think about when you want to attract these different types of wildlife that everybody enjoys viewing. So first, we're going to talk about hummingbirds. Everyone loves hummingbirds, and hummingbirds are energy incarnate. They are really, really energetic little creatures, as we all know. If you've ever had one buzz up in front of your face and then take off right away, their wing beats are beating at more than 40 beats per second, and their heart rate is at 1,260 beats per minute, where your average person's heart rate is somewhere in the 70 beats per minute range. So that means ounce for ounce, these hummingbirds have a metabolic rate 300 times more than that of a human. So there we see a little photo that I've taken of a hummingbird, and that was using 1/1000th of a second shutter speed, and you can still see all that motion blur on the wings. That's how fast those little wings beat. So let's think about the hummingbird's diet, because this is one way you're really going to attract them into your yard. They definitely do like sucrose, and that's what you're going to put in your little hummingbird feeders. Sucrose is just a high-level sugar is all that's going on. That's also what the plant flowers are producing within that nectar itself, and that's why they're coming to feed on the flowers. One thing they also need, though, is protein, and they get that from the insects they're picking off the plants and out of the flowers themselves. So they're not going to get that from the feeder solutions unless, of course, you got an ant problem coming up into your hummingbird feeders. We also should think about the fact that these plants were here long before we started setting up these little feeders with the sugar water in there. One important thing to note with those sugar water feeders is here in Arizona in the summertime, you want to empty and clean those feeders every 3 days in the summertime. Anything longer than that, you can start ending up with some bacterial pathogens in there that are going to harm the very hummingbirds you're trying to attract and feed. So the hummingbirds also do have a migration pattern. So we have lots and lots of hummingbirds that come through Arizona, but only a few of them stick around year round. So generally in the fall and the spring is when we're going to see the migratory ones. So they're going to be moving in the wintertime down from the mountains and out into the deserts, and then in the other direction in the summertime. They're going to escape the heat that we have down here in the valley. So when you're thinking about the plants that you're going to plant, think about when they bloom so you can make sure something's blooming during those times. So many of the 16 species don't actually come into the valley, but they do come through Arizona. But there's a lot of short day trips you can take where you can get to see other species that won't come through the valley itself. A lot of great places in Arizona that are specifically set up for hummingbird viewing. So let's talk about some of the plants out there and what we want to think about. And whenever you talk about plants for a hummingbird, the number one thing people always talk about is the red tubular flowers. That's what everyone talks about. In reality, any brightly colored flower is going to get their attention. So I see them on my lemon tree, and that is certainly not a red tubular flower. So we do want to use low water use plants whenever possible, and that's going to help keep our water bills lower. But low water use doesn't mean thorny. Not all low water use plants have thorns and spines on them, and low water use doesn't also mean ugly. There's lots of beautiful plants out there that are low water use and well adapted for our region. So again, don't forget the bloom timing. Make sure they're going to be blooming when the birds are coming through. And don't forget about different heights when you're grouping plants together. Don't accidentally put a shorter plant behind a taller plant. Otherwise, you're just not going to get to see it. But putting the shorter plants in front of the taller plants, that's going to help give your landscape some depth. So don't forget your color combinations out there as well. Don't plant everything that's one color. So you can use contrasting colors for a dramatic effect. So you can do some reds and some yellows, or some yellows and some oranges that really contrast against one another. Or you can do some complementary colors for a more soothing effect, such as your reds and blues and things like that. So not only do we want to think about the plants that they feed off of, we also want to think about the other plants around there for nesting and perching. And especially with the perching, it's really important when you're attracting hummingbirds to your area that after they come and feed on the area, they don't have to fly a long distance away so they can go take a rest, because remember how much energy they're expending out there. So make sure you include some plantings in your yard that have places for them to just sit and relax in between feedings. And then actually you get a much better chance to photograph them when they're sitting still. Photographing them on the flowers is actually kind of hard, so you take lots and lots of pictures where you just don't get them right, and then very few of them actually come out well. Also, don't forget to have some plantings that are blooming at the same time in different areas. The hummingbirds, especially like the Annas that is very common around here, those guys are very, very territorial, and they will chase each other away. I'm sure you've all seen it before. So let's talk something about some of the plants that we put out there for them to feed on. And Cape aloe is a very, very great plant. It's a very striking, dramatic plant, lots of structure and texture going on to it. It is a fairly large one. It gets about 5 foot by 3 foot, and the blooming time is winter through spring. That's actually kind of a nice thing about some of our aloes, is they will bloom earlier in the winter when other plants just don't bloom. Another good one is another aloe, and that's the medicinal aloe, commonly called aloe vera these days. So this one will get about 2 foot by 5 foot, and it blooms in the early spring. Another great one that works out there, and this one actually does have those red tubular flowers, is the desert honeysuckle. So once again, as you can see, low water use, well-adapted desert plants doesn't mean they're ugly and thorny and spiny. That's actually a very nice, beautiful plant. This one on average gets about 3 foot by 4 foot, so it's not a real large plant, so it'll fit in some of your more moderate sized areas. And the bloom time on this one is summer to late fall. And that's another thing when thinking about your bloom times. Don't plant everything in your yard that blooms at the same time. Make sure something is blooming in the yard throughout the year as much as you can. Another great plant is the yellow bird of paradise. So once again, no red tubular flowers, but they do have those beautiful long red stamens out there. Now this is a fairly large plant. You're talking about 10 foot by 8 foot, so make sure you have room for it. And the bloom time on this one is spring all the way into fall, so this one will bloom all summer long for you. Another one within the bird of paradise family is our red bird of paradise, very, very common plant out there. And this plant is one of the plants that'll give you the most bang for the buck on the least amount of water. Once these guys get established, they require very, very low amounts of water. We say in our information that they're going to get about 6 foot by 6 foot, but this one that I took the picture of is actually quite a bit bigger than that. And once again, this thing starts blooming in the spring all the way through the heat of summer and into the fall. Another good plant out there is something that most people don't think of as attracting hummingbirds because it doesn't have those tubular flowers, although they are red, is the Baja fairy duster. So that red one is the Baja fairy duster, and the whitish light pink one is actually the one that's native to our Arizona desert. Now these plants will get about 5 foot by 5 foot. So again, make sure you're doing the right plant in the right place. Make sure it has room to grow so you're not constantly going out there and trimming it off of sidewalks and patios and things like that, because the more you trim it like that, the less flowers you have. And this one also blooms starting in the spring through the summer all the way into fall. That's a really good thing to make sure you do have plants blooming in the heat of summer, especially for our year-round resident hummingbirds. So you got to make sure they have something to feed on during those hot, dry summers when a lot of plants just don't want to bloom. Another great one that's been very, very popular for a number of years is the emu bush, or Valentine bush is one of the cultivars out there. This one does get about 4 foot by 5 foot, so definitely give it the room. And this blooms in late winter to spring. So the reason why they call that one particular variety the Valentine bush is that one's going to be blooming right around February. Another great one out there, although it's not commonly seen, it's a good plant though, it's a firecracker bush. And this one gets about 4 foot by 4 foot, so you can put it in some of those smaller areas and still keep it well contained while allowing it to bloom. And this one also is going to bloom in the summer. This one does want some filtered shade. It doesn't want to be in that hot reflected heat next to a west wall. So underneath something like a Palo Verde tree would do really well on this particular one. The red yucca plant, very, very popular plant for many, many years out there. This does have those nice red to pink tubular flowers out there. Our information tells you it gets about 3 foot by 5 foot, but if you look at that one, make sure you're putting it in the right place. That one is far too close to that sidewalk over there and that driveway, so they're just going to have themselves in a constant fight with that plant. Whereas if they would have just moved it a few more feet in away from those edges, they would have been much more happy with the plant. This is another great one that starts blooming in the spring all the way into summer. Now, this one is actually really well known for hummingbirds because the name on this one is chuparosa, and in Spanish, chuparosa means hummingbird. So it's very appropriately named. This one will get about 4 foot by 4 foot. And again, these do tend to do a little bit better under some filtered shade or at least some afternoon shade. If they do get too shady, they tend to get a little bit leggy, stretching and reaching for that sunlight. But with some trimming back, hard trimming when they're young, you can get them to follow this more bush-like growth habit. And this one blooms in late winter through spring. So again, it's another great one that'll start blooming long before some of our more common desert plants that we see out there, like the oleanders and Texas sages. This starts blooming long before then. That way you do have some actual winter color in your yard. This one is red justicia. So this is a little bit smaller plant, about 3 foot by 3 foot. So it fits in some of those smaller areas. So you're not dealing with just all these large, huge plants out there. And this one tends to have a split blooming cycle. It'll bloom in the fall, and it generally doesn't bloom well in the cold of the winters, although lately we've had some very warm winters, and these have bloomed all the way through the winters, and then again in the spring, but they're not going to bloom in the summertime for you. We do have a bunch of different varieties of penstemons that we're going to talk about here, and hummingbirds love penstemons. So they are nice and small and compact, although over time they do kind of spread out. This one is a firecracker penstemon, so that's going to bloom late winter into spring, as will most of our penstemons. One of the most common penstemons we see out here is the Perry's penstemon. So this one does stay a little bit more narrow and a little bit more upright, so it will fit in some of those smaller areas for you. And it gets about 1.5 to 2 foot tall with some of those flower stalks. And as you can see, the hummingbirds really, really like that penstemon. So this one will bloom in the spring. It blooms a little bit later than the other one, and it does have a relatively short bloom cycle. Another penstemon that is very popular out there is the canyon penstemon. Gives you a slightly different color out there, and it's about 1 foot, 1.5 foot by 2 foot. So once again, for some of your smaller areas, and it is a spring bloomer only. One nice thing about the penstemons out here is if you're able to, after they're done blooming, allow them to create their seed pods and spread their own seeds. And that way, the next winter when it rains, you will have penstemon all over your yard. And one of the last penstemons we'll look at is a coral penstemon. It's got a nice vibrant red color on it. And once again, you can see the hummingbirds really love it. This one does get a little bit bigger by 2 foot by 3 foot on average. And it's a later bloomer in the late spring in our valley area. Another great one for some of those tinier areas are these smaller plants like the mealy cup sage. Once again, some afternoon shade or some filtered shade is going to do them well. They're going to get only about 1.5 foot by 1.5 foot, so they tuck into those little blank areas you have around your yard quite nicely. And they will bloom spring through fall, so they actually do bloom through the summertime. So while it does have a slightly tubular flower, it's purple instead of red. That gives you another color option for your yard. Another great one out there is the Mexican bush sage. This one does get a little bit larger. It's a 4 foot by 4 foot shrub. And the purple things you're seeing on those stalks are not actually the flower itself. Those are called calyxes. It's actually the small white part is the flower. Kind of like the bougainvillea, they don't have red flowers. Those are the bracts. The flower are actually those tiny little white things on the bougainvilleas. So this one will bloom late spring all the way into fall. So in the right location, it will bloom all the way through summer for you. Yellow bells, this is a native plant, native to northern Arizona, up in the higher elevations, but it does do quite well down here. And this plant will actually tolerate some of the tougher areas of your yard, some of those reflected heat areas. It is a large plant. We say about 6 foot by 6 foot, but if it's left alone long enough, it's going to actually get quite a bit bigger than that. And in some cases, I've actually seen them over the course of time trimmed into almost small trees, maybe about 10 foot by 10 foot. This is going to bloom through the summer, starting in spring all the way through fall. So you've got a really good long bloom season on this one. A relative of the Arizona yellow bells is the one we call orange bells. This is actually a combination between two different plants to get that different colored flower. And the Arizona yellow bells is one of the parent plants. This one also gets very, very large. This is an 8 foot by 5 foot plant. There are some varieties out there that do stay more compact. So if you have a smaller area and you still want this type of nice orange tubular flower, definitely check with your nursery professionals and look for some of those other varieties that stay a little bit smaller for you. One of the great things about this one is if we don't have a frost or any real cold winter, this thing will bloom literally 12 months out of the year in our valley. So they do really, really well. And as you can see, the hummingbirds definitely do appreciate it. Another good shrub out there is the Cape honeysuckle. This has been popular for a long time out there. It's one of your larger shrubs, going to get about 6 foot by 5 foot. Another nice thing I've seen done with this plant is along those pool fences, you can actually train this to go in and out between the posts on your pool fences and treat it more like a vine than a shrub. So if you've got a smaller area with that fence and you don't want to be looking at an ugly fence, maybe a little privacy on a fence that's see-through, this is a great option for you. We say about 6 foot by 5 foot, but if you do that vining option, it'll actually keep going and going and going. And this one is another one that does bloom year-round, provided we don't have any freezes in the wintertime. One of the great plants that are used for hummingbirds out there is actually, the common name for it is hummingbird trumpet. Another common name for it is a California hummingbird trumpet. It gets about 1 foot by 2 foot. So it's really nice if you do have some larger areas, actually group this one together. And this one will start blooming here in late summer and into the fall months. It works really, really well here. Now, one thing about this plant is the stems on it are very, very brittle. So if you plant it too close to a walkway where people are going to keep bumping into it and brushing by it, they're going to be breaking off those stems. So give it a little space between the traffic areas and you'll do pretty good. Now, one other thing that we've seen on this particular plant, and actually all the other plants out there, is when you do plant them, sooner or later, these guys are going to come along. These are verdins. They are not hummingbirds, but they love that nectar just as much as the hummingbirds do. But you'll see they don't have that nice long beak and that nice long tongue that the hummingbirds do. So what these guys do is they actually tear the flower off the outside petals so they can get at the inside flower parts and actually get at the nectar. It can be a little disheartening with young plants that have very few flowers and you're trying to get the hummingbirds to come. But once the plant gets to maturity, it'll have enough flowers for everybody. Another great plant that does attract the hummingbirds is actually a tree. It's our desert willow tree. It has that beautiful tubular flower on it. That actually happens to be one of the different varieties that has that bicolored flower on that. So definitely talk to your nursery personnel and talk about some of the different varieties out there. You can get some different flower colors. You can get some different growth sizes. This is a pretty good sized tree, but not a huge tree. And this is a good thing to know because so many times we see people plant these giant trees in these tiny little yards, and then later on they just have to remove the tree. Whereas this one only gets about 25 by 20 feet. Now in the wintertime, this is deciduous, so it does drop its leaves. So you're going to have those bare sticks out there. So if that's not something you want to look at, plant it in an offset side of the yard where it's not the dominant tree in the yard itself. And this one will bloom spring and into the fall. So it does bloom a pretty long bloom season out there. So that's pretty much it for the food plants. So let's talk about some of the nesting and perching plants out there. So one of the great perching plants you have out there is the desert willow. Gets about 25 feet by 20 feet, has a blooms that attracts the hummingbirds, and it's also a great place where it has a lot of those smaller branches that the tiny feet of those hummingbirds need to perch on. Another great plant, if you're looking for some place for your hummingbird to sit and perch and review their area, is the ocotillo. So they will sit right up on the tops of those canes and kind of watch out over their territory. This does get about 12 foot by 10 foot. And it does have the blooms we say in the spring, but actually when the summer monsoons come in right after the rain, it'll put out brand new bloom stalks right at that time. They respond to the rain quite well. And this one, when they are in bloom, is also very good for a feeding plant. So we also have the Palo Verdes out there. This is a great nesting and a perching species. It does have the smaller branches out towards the end that they like to hang out on. But in some cases, you know, it's a native tree. This is what the birds have been used to since long before we got here. So they will nest in them. This tree gets pretty good size. It's about 25 foot by 25 foot. So make sure you've got the room for it. It does bloom in the spring with those nice, beautiful yellow flowers. They will actually pretty much nest about anywhere, but we do like to use some of the desert adapted plants or the native desert plants. But this one actually happens to be an Indian rosewood or a sisu tree. Now this tree is a very, very large tree, so if you're going to plant it in your yard, make sure you give it the space it needs to grow. So they'll also nest in a lot of your larger shrubs, including this oleander. So there was a news story in the paper a bunch of years ago about a garden center in a Target here in Gilbert, where a mother hummingbird had nested right on top of a hose faucet in the garden area. So they had to tape off the area to keep people away from it. But she actually did raise her babies there, and they flew off and became part of the natural environment. So this one we say 6 foot by 4 foot. It depends on which oleander you're talking about, whether it's a petite variety. The full-size oleanders, over the course of time, they can get very, very large, so make sure you do have the room for them. Oh, when it talks about perching, like I said, anything that has those nice skinny limbs on there that they can actually get their feet around, and they do like high places to actually survey their territory, especially those very territorial Anna's hummingbirds. So any high place, so there you'll see it's actually a stick. That's in my backyard where we had a frost one year and my orange bills had gotten frozen back. So I had a bunch of these dead sticks sticking out from the plant. I purposely left a few of them there because I know that's right where those hummingbirds do like to sit. So a lot of people would look at me and wonder why I had that ugly dead stick coming out of my plant. That's why. So again, they like the little sticks, and then actually if they're sitting still, they're a lot easier to take pictures of if that's something you'd like to do. So they also need those perching places to get into some shady areas so they can escape the heat. So make sure when you're pruning out your trees, you do leave some of those areas for them to sit in. Let's talk about the butterflies. Now, there's too many species around here to list them all, but we definitely do have lots and lots of butterflies, and people do like to bring them in. The main western monarch migration does happen to the west of us, but we will still see them during the migration season out there. So when we're talking about butterflies, we need to think about the plants we're going to put out there to feed them. It is best done with plants. You'll notice if you go to some of the hummingbird places where they do it at the Desert Botanical Garden or Butterfly Wonderland, they will set out some fruit slices for them. So they do like them, but so do many birds and insects. So you may want to just go ahead and stick with the plants. So when we think about the plants that the butterflies like, we talk about composite flowering plants. So that sunflower is a perfect example of a composite flower. So it's got the rayed out petals on there, and then all the tiny little seed areas in the middle. And that's where they like to feed on. So some great feeding plants out there. We do want to think about that as far as feeding the butterflies themselves. But don't forget about the caterpillars. We want to actually have a place for them to do their cocooning. And when they come out, they're going to be very hungry. So that means you're going to be putting in plants on purpose for the caterpillars to eat them. So if you're going to do that, maybe do that in some less visible areas. So here we have two local butterfly caterpillars there. One is the queen butterfly and one is the caterpillar of the monarch butterfly. And you see they look very, very similar. So some great plants if we're looking at attracting butterflies. A good one is called bee brush. It's a pretty good sized plant, 6 foot by 6 foot, and it does start blooming in the spring and runs all the way into the fall. The flame honeysuckle is a great plant, even though it's not that typical composite flower. The butterflies will come visit it, about a 3 foot by 4 foot size, summer to late fall. Note the dual use, because if you remember, this is also a great plant that the hummingbirds like as well. Desert milkweed, this is a plant you really want to put in your garden if you want to attract butterflies. It does get about 3 foot by 3 foot. Some people don't think it's that attractive of a plant, so you can put it in some less visible areas of your yard. It does bloom spring to fall, but the flowers themselves are just kind of those little cream colored things you see on top, so it's not a super showy flower, but the butterflies are very, very attracted to it. And the reason why you want to put these in your garden here is the monarchs and queens are specifically dependent on the milkweed species out there. So you can actually look into becoming a monarch way station if you put a bunch of these plants in your garden. Woolly butterfly bush, it does have those composite flowers that the butterflies do like. Not a super showy flower, and it is a pretty good sized plant, about 5 foot by 5 foot. So this is kind of one of those foundation plants. It just kind of sits there and then it blooms spring to summer. So it does have those orangish colored flowers on there, but they're not super showy. So kind of one of those foundation plants you're going to use. The fairy duster, not necessarily that composite flower that we think about with butterflies, but they definitely do like this one. About 5 foot, spring to fall, nice long bloom season. And once again, that dual use. Both your hummingbirds and your butterflies will be attracted to this one. The birds of paradise, we've already talked about this guy, that red bird of paradise out there, spring to fall, nice long bloom season, very low water use plant. And again, it is attracting both your hummingbirds and your butterflies. The bush dahlia is a great plant. It's more of a lower growing plant, but it does get up to about 4 foot by 5 foot. There are some ground cover versions of dahlias that work quite well. This will bloom in the winter into the spring, so that'll give you that different season of color out there that sometimes is kind of hard to achieve. Now, the picture showing those flowers might be a little bit deceptive because those are actually very, very small flowers, but when it's in bloom, the entire plant is covered in them. So it changes the entire color of the plant itself when it's in bloom. Some of those smaller areas, think about some more of those sunflower type flowers like the golden disodia, only gets about 1/2 foot by 1/2 foot. So these can also be done quite well in group plantings to increase the impact out there. And these will bloom spring through to fall, all the way through the summertime. Another one is the desert marigold plant, and it is on its own a very small plant, only about 1 foot by 1 foot. This will bloom year round, especially with our milder winters we've been having lately. But if you do plant this plant, be aware that it is very aggressive at reseeding itself. So anywhere it drops seeds, where it gets moisture, you're going to have lots and lots of desert marigolds popping up. That may be a good thing, or it may be something you decide you don't want. Fleabane is a very, very good plant that does attract the butterflies. Individually, a smaller plant. It does bloom in the springtime, but look at what's going on in that bed that you see on that flower to the right-hand side. It is also an aggressive reseeder and will spread through an entire planted area. So you may want to put it in some sort of a contained area where it's contained by hardscape, whether it's sidewalks, driveways, walls of your homes or buildings. That'll kind of help keep it in one place. The giant hesperaloe. This is a very, very large plant. Gets those wonderful big white flowers out there that the hummingbirds do like, and also some of your nocturnal feeders such as the moths out there as well. This one will bloom spring to summer, and then after it's done blooming, you just cut out those seed stalks once the flower is done doing its bloom. Lantana. Everyone knows about lantana, and of course, the butterflies really love it with those composite flowers. Can be contained to about 2 foot by 3 foot. If you've got a bigger area and you can let them go, they'll actually get a bit bigger than that. But once again, especially with the milder winters we've been having recently, these can bloom year round. And of course, not only do we have the bush lantana out there, but we do have the trailing lantana, and these are available in both purple and white varieties. The purple one is the one you see most commonly out there. So it only gets about 1 foot high by about 4 foot wide. Now this one really, really doesn't like to be out in full sun, and especially near things like sidewalks and driveways. Underneath some filtered shade like a Palo Verde tree or something like that, it's going to perform much better for you. And once again, with mild winters, you can see year-round bloom with this. The Baja Passion Vine is a unique one where you can train it up on a vine on the wall. It has a very, very striking flower out there, and it does get a pretty good size for a vine out there. It can go about 10 foot by 10 foot. It does bloom in the summertime, and this is also specific to the Gulf fritillary. Now, not only does the Gulf fritillary adult feed on the flowers itself, the picture I have of that butterfly wasn't on a Baja passion vine, but they are attracted to the passion vine itself specifically because they will lay their eggs on it, and that means you're also going to have that plant get eaten by the caterpillars. Several different verbenas out there can do well in the right locations. So once again, pay attention, talk to your nursery professionals, find out what kind of exposure they'd like as far as the sun. They're not large plants, so they can fill in some of your small areas, and they do bloom fairly short bloom season in the spring. So we have the Goodings verbena and also the moss verbena out there. Still a fairly low growing, not a very large plant out there. And this one, though, in the right location will bloom through the summertime from spring all the way to fall. Prairie zinnias, these are some of your nice small plants. They can be tucked into little areas. They work really, really well to make those boulders that you pay a lot of money for. It seems kind of strange that you're going to put a plant next to it and kind of cover it up when it was a very expensive rock. But that actually makes for a much more natural looking yard rather than just a big rock plopped down in the middle of the yard. So these will bloom in the summertime all the way out into the fall for you. So we've covered some good plants here, and these are obviously not all the plants that'll do a great job of attracting these butterflies and hummingbirds to your yard. So you do have a great online source for all sorts of plant info. You can get that through the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association plant website, amwa.org/plants, and you can actually use the advanced search function, and you can see down there in the corner for wildlife, you can select birds, hummingbirds, butterflies, all of them or any combination of them that you would like. You've also got lots of other options there, such as plant type, whether it's a shrub, a tree, or a vine. You can search for plants at specific sizes and specific flower seasons and specific flower colors. And you can add those plants once you decide you like one to what they call your wish list. And then afterwards, you can go ahead and print up that list wish for when you go shopping at the nursery. So real quick, let's talk about maintenance here. We have some unusual maintenance practices here in the valley. They've been around for a long time, and it has to do with those power head shears. But on these emu bushes, how many hummingbirds are actually going to be attracted to those particular plants? They have a couple flowers on them, but not many because they've been turned into these weird little cupcake shapes. Whereas if you do a more natural pruning, look at how many more flowers that plant has on it. You're just going to get a lot better attraction factor out of this for the things you're trying to bring in, like those hummingbirds. So now when we talk about natural pruning, it doesn't mean no pruning. And then that prior picture, that plant may have seemed a little wild and out of control for some people's taste. And that's okay. You still want to do some pruning. But what you do want to remember is that shearing removes the flowers. And the flowers are what attract the hummingbirds. The flowers are what attract the butterflies. So you're planting these plants specifically to attract these hummingbirds and butterflies, but after a while, you go out and shear the flowers off all the time, and you wonder where the hummingbirds and the butterflies went. So your best pruning tool out there is actually going to be your good old-fashioned hand pruners rather than those power head shears. Now, if you ever have to do some large reduction pruning or rejuvenation pruning is what we call it, when you purposely trim back a plant very, very hard and very, very short and small and then allow it to regrow, that's where the power tools come into play for you. So one thing also about this shearing is you're removing a lot of the foliage of the plant material and the leaves. If we remember the good old photosynthetic process from junior high school chemistry, is how the plant makes food. So when you keep removing all the leaves, you're removing the food making capability of the plant. So when you're doing this, some species do handle it better than others, but in a lot of cases, what you're doing is slow motion herbicide. So here's this grouping of all this one species of plant, and the landscape architect's original intent was for all these plants to kind of grow together so that when they come into bloom, it was one giant area of all these wonderful, glorious flowers. But for some reason, the landscaper thinks they need to be trimmed into these strange little humps individually. And you can see a few of them have already died, and some of them are on their way out. Now, one thing we get asked about a lot when we talk about these plants, especially when we're purposely putting in plants with flowers to attract our hummingbirds and butterflies that we want, we may want to think about what to do with bees. These bright and scented flowers definitely do draw in the bees. One thing to remember about the bees out there is they have no interest in you if they're feeding. You can actually walk up to a bee on that lemon flower while he's feeding and give him a light little tap, and the only thing he will do is move to the next flower. They really don't have any interest in harming you or doing anything with you when they're interested in collecting their nectar for making their honey. Now, sometimes if they do begin to nest out there, that can cause a problem, and that's time to bring somebody in. For many years with the Africanized honeybees, unfortunately, anybody who dealt with bees automatically killed the hive. That is starting to transition back to the old way, where a lot of these bee control companies out there are actually removing the hives intact and alive and bringing them elsewhere. So one thing you have to remember about bees is they pollinate more than 50% of our food supply. So if you like to eat, don't kill the bees. This particular scenario was just a migrating bee swarm that happened to migrate over to the eave of my house. So after about 3 days, they took off and went on their merry way. So I just had to mind what I was doing, not make any sudden moves or loud noises over in that area of the yard until they decided to move on. And that's one thing to always remember about bees. Leave them alone and they will gladly return the favor. So thank you for watching. We do have some things here to talk about. So I hope this has helped you learn a little bit more about some great plants and some great techniques to attract these hummingbirds and butterflies to your yard. If you do have more questions, definitely email them to us. You can do that at that email address on that top line, water.conservation@gilbertaz.gov. Also, we are going to have 2 live question and answer sessions. So you can sign up for those at gilbertaz.gov/water workshops. And on Thursday, October 22nd at 10 a.m., that Q&A session is going to be for the plants and butterflies in your yard. And we have another presentation that we have out there that is just more for generic plants, how to design a good landscape, how to put in the plants, and how to take care of them. And then on October 29th at 10 a.m., that question and answer session is all going to be about the landscape watering presentation and the controller programming presentation.